Let's see. Charlotte sorry, Michelina, that's sorry.
Daunting audience, I have to say, Rachel.
There are more people coming in. Hey, I think that we can begin. People are still entering the meeting, but many of us are here. So, hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to the first lecture of the Iran Forum series on Israel-Iran relations, hosted here at the Allianz Center for Iranian Studies. We have an exciting lineup of speakers to look forward to throughout the year. And today we're extremely fortunate to have with us Professor Ali Ansari. Professor Ansari is the Professor of Iranian History and founding director of the Institute for Iranian Studies at the University of St. Andrews. He's a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. In 2016, he was elected a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. In 2018, he was elected vice president of the British Institute for Persian Studies and re-elected president in 2023. Among his many publications are Modern Iran since 1797, Iran, Islam and Democracy, The Politics of Managing Change, Politics of Nationalism in Modern Iran, and Confronting Iran, The Failure of U.S. Policy and the Roots of Mistrust. As an undergrad student some time ago, I remember encountering his 2006 book, Confronting Iran, right here. So I returned to it just ahead of this session. And I was struck by something that he had to say about American-Iranian relations. He wrote, "To understand the current predicament, one must understand the evolution of the relationship. The enmity that exists today cannot be understood outside the intimacy that preceded it. Friendship precedes betrayal." Seems that that might also be somewhat true of Israel-Iran relations as well. And I imagine we'll hear something of that historic intimacy in Iran-Israel relations, as well as important insights about the evolution of these relations. Professor Ansari is a valued colleague to us here at the Allianz Center for Iranian Studies. We're grateful for the opportunity to learn from and engage with his insights today. Professor Ansari, you can have the Zoom floor, please.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you all very much for turning out. It's wonderful to see so many of you, so many friends as well online. So many of you actually who probably know a good deal more about this relationship than I do. So I'm looking forward. Hopefully, in the discussion, maybe we can sort of thrash out some of the ideas. Rachel has probably highlighted the central theme of my argument, really, which is absolutely central to what I believe to be not only Iran's relations with the West, but I think perhaps more acutely Iran's relationship with Israel and the wider Jewish community. By the way, I mean, for me, obviously, the relationship is a historic relationship. It's a relationship that can only be understood within its context, and I think far too often. I mean, if there's one criticism I'm going to have is really a methodological one, which is that I think in our modern social sciences and international relations dominated sort of policy world, we tend to suffer from what I consider to be the malaise of presentism, and that is really this issue that we see everything through the guise of the present, and we tend to not have very a good sense of the context of a particular relationship, the horizons really going backwards and forwards in that sense. And, you know, in some ways, to paraphrase Churchill, in a sense, if you want to know what's going to happen, you have to really sort of look as far back. The further back you look, the further forward you can project. And certainly what we find with what I might call in the beginning, you know, Perso-Judaic relations is a very intimate and long-standing relationship, one which I'll touch upon. I mean, there are many other people who I know, particularly also obviously in Israel and others who I've talked to, who know this much more intimately and much better than I do. But it's something that's fascinated me really in terms of the long-standing relationships between the Jewish people and the Iranian peoples. Not simply going back to the obviously the question of the Achaemenids and Cyrus the Great, although I do notice that I think the three countries in the world that have a certain affectation for Cyrus the Great are Israel, Iran, and the United States. So I sort of think that rather than the Abrahamic Accords, we should have the Cyrus Accords as well, and that might be some way to move us forward in the longer term. Um, they certainly, you know, the Iranians, like anyone else, like a good bit of flattery, and I think Israel has been good at it in the past. But I think it's something that highlights obviously the longer term relationship, and that relationship is not simply political; it's also theological, it's religious. We could talk about certainly the cross fertilization between ancient Iranian faiths and Judaism, Zoroastrianism and Judaism, and how that has sort of basically the ideas have been translated from one into the other, and how they've affected the way in which each people think about the world. So we know, for instance, about not only the fact that yes, the standard story of the liberation of the Jews back to Jerusalem, but of course, many of the Jewish peoples remained in Mesopotamia, in Babylonia, and of course, we have the Babylonian Talmud and all sorts of other things that sort of contribute, I suppose, to that longer term intimacy that underpins, I think, the relationship. But I think some of the things that interest me is not so much even just that ancient heritage, which is important for obvious reasons, and it's important in part because we think it's important. But also the medieval relationship, which is also interesting. I was very struck to discover, when I was talking to colleagues and others, that it's very likely, and I think others on this screen will have something to say about it, but it's very likely that New Persian, for instance, was first written in Hebrew characters, for instance, and there was clearly a sort of a relationship between those Jewish inhabitants of the Iranian plateau and obviously the wider Iranian community there, which we see in things like the Ardashir army, for instance, and the way in which the various mythologies, if you will, the various narratives and myths of ancient Iran and the biblical world, the biblical inheritance, basically at times merged. I mean, we clearly see that there's something longer there. So, I mean, I'm very much in favor, as you can see, of taking a sort of a historical point of view, depending on how you frame that debate. If you frame the debate purely in terms of the modern period, either from 1948 onwards or from 1979 onwards, you get a particular understanding of the relationship. But as Rachel was saying earlier, if you look at the longer term relationship and the intimacy of that relationship, you can then situate our current problems, to use an English understatement, in their proper historical context, and sort of understand, and this is, I suppose, my central theme in that sense, that the level of antipathy that does exist or has existed in some ways is predicated on the fact that there is a much more nuanced and intimate relationship that precedes it. I do think that the ideology, obviously, of the Islamic Revolution has particular problems with it. I mean, let's be frank about it. I'm not going to diminish that, but I also think that the general attitude of Iranians as a whole is quite different, and it's quite different from the way in which the regime presents it, and that has to reflect a deeper sort of relationship, not one that's unproblematic, by the way. I mean, I'm not one of these people that considers that, for instance, there have not been, for instance, pogroms in Iran against various religious minorities, be they Jewish or Zoroastrian or even Christian at some times, and certainly against the Baha'is, for instance, which is very, very explicit, obviously, in the present day. I mean, I don't want to be romantic about it, but at the same time, we do know that the relationship has been perhaps a much more cooperative, if not collaborative would be the wrong word, but one that basically tolerates the other in a way that and sort of engages with the other, which certainly would shed a different light really on current relations. So I think one of the things that we have to bear in mind is the longevity of the relationship. And I did write in an article, other people can correct me, I don't know whether I get this rightly or wrong, but the Iranian Jewish population in particular, and certainly even those Iranian Jews that have migrated out of Iran and either live in the West or in Israel today, still harbor a particular affection, I think, is the right word to say, towards Iran itself in the grand scheme of things. Again, you have to distinguish between Iran as a political culture, away from the Islamic Republic as a political system. So I think those two things have to be distinguished. But nonetheless, there's clearly some sort of affection that works there. And as I wrote in that Foreign Affairs article, this idea that Israel is the mother, and it's either it's one way or the other. I think David will correct me on this, but it's either Israel is the mother and Persia is the father, or the other way around. But this sort of idea that Iranian Jews have this sort of real affection for Iran as one of the sort of cultural homes of Judaism in that sense. And that runs very, very strongly throughout runs as a very, very strong theme, I think, certainly among the Iranian Jewish diaspora. So it's one that's I think quite striking in the way it sort of colors the relationship. And you see that really, for me, which is quite striking, when you do get the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Iran is one country in which there isn't a particular reaction to this. I mean, if you look at the sources at the time, people don't get overexcited about the establishment of the State of Israel. Ayatollah Khashoggi tries at the time to run some sort of demonstrations against the foundation of the State of Israel, and nobody really can be bothered to go. In fact, even the British Foreign Office documents who talk about it at the time say there's very little interest here. Nobody can get very excited about it. And certainly the relationship towards the emergent State of Israel in the first years of its existence were, to say the least, ambivalent to the point of positive, if I can put it that way. So that, even during the Mossadegh years and others, there was a sort of background channels were created. There was no sort of particular virulent animosity. It wasn't so much that Iran was going to go out of its way to recognize the State of Israel, but it certainly wasn't going to unrecognize it, if I can put it that way. It had a sort of a de facto rather than a de jure recognition. And of course, as we know, relationships during the Pahlavi period and certainly during the reign of Mohammad Reza Shah became fairly good for all practical purposes, with the existence of sort of a de facto diplomatic relations, even if they weren't de jure, regular engagement, particularly on economic affairs, as well as others, we should say, often in political and security, but certainly that sort of engagement existed. And what was striking really about it was the Iranian attitude to that was, as I said, a lot more ambivalent. Perhaps most striking in these, and I know a colleague in Israel had done I think it was in Tel Aviv. I think it was in your institute, actually, in your center, that did it. The translation of Jalal al-Ahmad's travelogue, Dar Velayat Israel. And again, that's very striking because it shows that this is not really just particularly a view of the sort of Pahlavi establishment. It's not a political elite view. Now, it's true that Jalal al-Ahmad's views of Israel change after 1967. And certainly among ordinary Iranians, there is a sort of a pivot after 1967 that leans much more into sort of sympathy for the Palestinian cause after that war. But what I think is striking about it is that really al-Ahmad, who is basically a dissident and a left-wing dissident in Iran, writes a very, very positive account for large parts of the text. Actually, it's only at the last bits that he starts to pivot. But large parts of the text are very, very complimentary about what Israel represents. And of course, it's the same type of attitude towards Israel that you get from a lot of socialist and left-leaning parties in Europe that see it basically as a sort of a socialist haven of some sort. So, and a sort of an experiment in a sense in communal living, if I can put it that way. But it was certainly seen as something that was fairly positive. So this sort of just reminds us that if you look at a broad stream of political views in Iran, the relationship there was never as antagonistic as you were going to get in the Arab world. And of course, this related, as I said, in the background to the historic relationship. It related to the fact that people felt there was a much more intimate and longer term connection between the two peoples. It connected also to the fact that the Iranian Jewish community tended to be very, very, in their own, for those who obviously didn't migrate, tended to be very loyal also to the Pahlavi state, or what the Pahlavi state was was attempting and saw themselves also as Iranian, which also helped when it comes to Iranian nationalism. Of course, that always helps. They were seen as as an important minority in that sense, and an important minority that can contribute a lot to the development of Iran. So that relationship was important. And of course, as Israel as being another non-Arab state, and as far as the Israelis are concerned, Iran being a non-Arab state, there was a certain connection there that could be that could be retained and promoted. Now, obviously, all this changes, as I said, really post 67, but I think it's a longer term. It's a slow change. It's certainly there. I think the Iranian attitude to um, uh, uh, Iranian Jews is also in some ways quite different. They tried to make that distinction between Zionism and Judaism and this, that, and the other. And you get this a lot more, obviously, in the post-revolutionary period. And the post-revolutionary period in 1979 obviously is an inflection point, and I don't think we can disguise it. I don't think anyone can pick up Khomeini's Islamic government and not detect within it. I don't think it's very hard to detect quite strong strands of anti-Semitism throughout that text. If you look at Islamic government, it's a pretty anti-Semitic text. Despite the attempts of some people to try and whitewash it and to sort of say that it's it's simply promoting some form of an Islamic government. This is a fairly robust text with a lot of conspiracy theorizing within it, of which obviously the Jewish community and Jews as a whole get are targeted, and this obviously feeds into the new ideology of the Islamic Revolution. Now, here, for those of you, when we look at the whole doctrine, the whole sort of development of anti-Semitism as a whole, I mean, you see it in this country as well. It's the way in which anti-Jewishness sort of combines and synthesizes with a sort of an anti-capitalist, anti-capitalism in the West. So the left and the right, in a sense, can sort of combine in some ways in a sort of in an attack on Judaism. And you see that obviously in the revolution, because the revolution itself combines the sort of Islamism of the religious right with the sort of anti-capitalism and iconoclasm, anti-Westernism, if you will, of the left in the revolution. And this starts to feed through into the ideology. But I suppose what's most peculiar for me is how long this takes actually to sort of settle into the public consciousness of Iran, not simply into the popular consciousness, but also into the political consciousness. Because, one of the great anomalies, of course, of the earlier period of the revolution is the Iran-Contra scandal. And the Iran-Contra scandal, of course, involves, Israeli middlemen. And it's always been a bafflement to me that actually, members of the Islamic Republic and the senior echelons of the Islamic Republic, having outlined a particular ideology of what they felt the Jewish state represented, was still willing, nonetheless, to engage with Israel, albeit on an informal basis, in order to secure arms for the war effort. So that, for me, represents a bit of a hangover. It's a hangover from the earlier period, and it's one of the things that in some ways is almost like tacitly accepted and goes forward. I wouldn't want to say that there was any conscious, I mean, I know the Americans argued at the time, and Patrick and others will be able to shed more light on this, but Americans argued at the time that certainly the Reagan administration, that it was an attempt in some ways to reach out to moderates in Iran and so on and so forth. I don't know how realistic that was, and I don't know how clear an ambition that was. I think from the Iranian perspective, and certainly from the perspective of the Islamic Republic, it's it wasn't something at the forefront of their minds. It was almost like, what they were being engaged in was was just a very pragmatic piece of commercial transaction, if you will. But it is very striking that they didn't sort of really see they didn't see the fact that Israelis were acting as middlemen, that there should be a problem. It's all the more surprising when you think about, obviously, what's going on in southern Lebanon and how the Iranians were supporting, obviously, the establishment of Hezbollah. Although I should add on this, as we know, that the development of Iranian links with southern Lebanon and Lebanon really a product of the Shah's later period in the 1970s. It's the Islamic Republic, obviously, that turns this into a much more sort of military side of things with Hezbollah. But that's one aspect of it. And of course, it also highlights the fact that you see in the Islamic Republic these contradictions in their policy, and also a duality in a sort of a policy as they go forward. But what you're clearly seeing as the revolution progresses is the dominance of one narrative over the other. I mean, that's very clear. And I don't think actually these things harden until later in the 1990s, to be honest. I think there's always a sort of a casual anti-Semitism that goes on within the political elite of the Islamic Republic, but they don't actually consolidate it until, it doesn't become a hard doctrine almost till much later, certainly after the period of Rafsanjani and Khatami, where these things are very, as I said, they're very casual, but it never gets in the way of a pragmatic deal, if you can put it that way. And we saw some of this. I mean, one of the interesting things about this, and I think David will remember this actually, but in the post 9/11 period, I was very struck, for instance, that there was and I've written about this, there was in the immediate post 9/11 period, I think we had there was a moment, I think then, where there was the possibility of a sort of almost a détente actually to emerge. And I think it was a very small window, by the way. I don't think many of the hardliners in Iran would have accepted it. But I think there was a distinct possibility under the Khatami administration at the time that they were exploring the possibility of a détente, in which, because the chief culprits of 9/11 were obviously Egyptian and Saudi, that this would tilt the American position in the Middle East, but also that there was the possibility at some stage. And we saw this in the much vaunted, if dismissed, I have to say, grand bargain that emerged later in 2003, this idea that there could be some sort of rapprochement, in a sense. I wouldn't, rapprochement is too strong a term perhaps, but certainly a détente, which included Israel in all this. And it is very striking. It's just a reminder, by the way, again, that the ideology of the Islamic Republic took time to mold itself into what it has become now. And I wouldn't want to underestimate what it has become now. But the fact is that at the time, I think it's very difficult. One of the criticisms I have of the whole study of political science, international relations in that sense, is it tends to not understand process as well as I think historians do, which is that, the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Revolution was not completed in 1979. It takes time to sort of like shape and mold itself. And, there were opportunities. I mean, I don't disagree with those at the time who said that, there were opportunities to try and mold and shape the way in which the revolution went. I don't think the West did a particularly good job, by the way, but, or for that matter, some of the politicians in Israel. But I think there was an opportunity there. And, for reasons that are far too complex for this talk, they were missed. And a lot of the fault, of course, lies within Iran itself. There were many, many opponents to any form of détente within Iran itself. But it is quite striking that in the post 9/11 period, and I think the period from between 2001 and 2003, there may have been an opportunity to explore. I think, after George Bush's Axis of Evil speech in January 2002, the door was closing, and it was closing very, very fast. Yes, the grand bargain document sort of emerges around 2003, 2004, in different ways that has been reported in some publications, I should say. But nonetheless, it was dismissed, and it was dismissed for reasons that are not unreasonable. But it's a pity, I think, it was dismissed so quickly, because it did indicate there were elements within the Iranian political elite who were looking for a way out, and didn't say, and they used to say, and I remember people would say to me, they said, we cannot be more Palestinian than the Palestinians. If the Palestinians choose to make peace with Israel, then we cannot sit around, causing mayhem. Of course, this was not a view held by hardliners in Iran, who were quite adamant that the Palestinians didn't know what was good for them, and therefore they ought to really be driving the seat. And they also felt a great objection at the time. They said after the Madrid talks started after the first Gulf War, they sort of complained why the Iranians had not been invited to sit at the table. I mean, there were obvious reasons why they were not. But at the same time, the argument was, had we brought Iran in at that time, there might have at least been an opportunity for some sort of dialogue. I'm not sure how realistic that was myself, but it was an argument, and it was one they would pursue, quite long into the early noughties. And it's one that I'll come back to when I talk a little bit about what I think future possibilities and solutions are. So I think, up until then, there's an indication there, really, till about 2003, that things are a little bit more malleable or more fluid in a sense than we think, although it's certainly moving in a certain direction. And then, of course, we get the cataclysm of Ahmadinejad, and Ahmadinejad basically seals the deal. I mean, we shouldn't have any illusions about what he represents and what he represented. And what he represented was basically an attempt to essentially consolidate the revolution in a particular direction of travel. And to my mind, Ahmadinejad represents the cataclysm of the Islamic Revolution. I mean, for all that those of us studying him can find him frustrating and quite entertaining in the same measure, I think for Iran's development and Iran's revolution, it was a catastrophe. Not only did he destroy really what elements of civil society had been built up in the last 15 years, and these were modest gains, by the way, but the modest gains themselves were thrust out. He then promulgated a very, very hardline ideology on Israel in particular. But you have to see the position on Israel as being part of a much wider ideological worldview. And we can thank Ahmadinejad actually for making it so clear, I suppose, is the best way to think about him. But essentially, Ahmadinejad, who has a PhD in traffic management, let's not forget that, and is not a nuanced person. Okay, I mean, despite the best attempts of people in the Western press to say that, when he said the Holocaust was a myth, he was talking about it in terms of social science, as if he'd been reading Roland Barthes or something. I mean, this sort of thing is nonsense. And I think we ought to be very clear that he didn't have that sort of subtlety. When he talks about, Israel will be wiped from the pages of history, it's not about a passive voice and all this sort of nonsense. I mean, there's been a lot of drivel written about, a lot of ink spilt about this. And, the one thing with Ahmadinejad, sadly, we spend all our times as Persianists and others saying, the nuance of the idioms of Persian language. Sadly, with Ahmadinejad, this does not apply. I mean, he's just not a man of subtlety. He wanted to say it as it was. And as far as he was concerned, he was speaking truth to power. And for him, Israel is part of a wider problem, but is the linchpin. And this goes back to this idea of what I was telling you at the beginning about the Islamic Revolution being a wonderful melange, in a sense, of both left-wing and right-wing ideas, both reactionary, but also sort of an anti-capitalist narrative. And for Ahmadinejad, the international order, as he expected, is unjust. The international order as set up post-45 is unjust. And, Iranian diplomats in this period, particularly under Ahmadinejad, had this wonderful tendency of going particularly to German politicians and sort of lamenting with them about what a bad deal they got after 1945. And that, interestingly enough, we Aryans need to stick together, which, as you can imagine, for, German politicians was pretty difficult to sort of stomach. And many of them would sort of walk away. But this is sort of absurdity that you're faced with. And I say these, because I want you to really appreciate just how absurd the situation was becoming. And for him, this international order was unjust, needed to be reformed. And the linchpin or the keystone to the whole architecture of this was Israel. And Israel had been founded, as he understood it, on the falsity, the sort of fake news, if you will, of the Holocaust. And all you had to do was to speak truth to power, and the whole thing would crumble away, and we would, enter a new dawn of, whatever, liberty and justice under the leadership of Iran, obviously, or Iran and Russia, actually, is the way things are going. But, there was a real sort of attitude here that he thought, and we got this very early. So I think it was in 2005, he becomes president, and he already has his first Holocaust conference, I think, at the end of that year. And he starts to really promote these ideas. And you can see, actually, and it goes back again to when I say Khomeini was if you look at his writings, are very anti-Semitic. I mean, this is where he's drawing from. I mean, this is what he's... So when people said, it's not his ideas, they're Khomeini's ideas, in many ways, they're absolutely right. I mean, that's basically what he was doing. He was re-articulating and re-uploading, in a sense, these ideas and pushing them very, very far forward. But you could see also in many of his ideas, which were of huge embarrassment, I have to say, to many Iranians. Many Iranians found the whole Holocaust denial stuff to be horrendous. Absolutely horrendous. I mean, they didn't like it. And if you saw, for instance, the relationship that the Khatami administration had with the local Jewish population, I remember talking to a number of the Jewish deputies at the time who said that, the Ahmadinejad administration is a catastrophe for them. I mean, it's like, the whole thing has been a fiasco. And they found it very insensitive, very problematic. And despite the fact that Ahmadinejad would say, oh, yes, but I'm not talking about them. These are Persian Jews are different from regular Jews or something. I mean, this sort of absurdity that you get, with nationalism, by the way. So there was a huge amount of friction, I think, and awkwardness among many in the sort of the more moderate political elite at the time. They didn't like the discussion about the Holocaust at all. Khatami actually spoke out against it very explicitly. But then, the whole notion of anti-Zionism certainly was a different matter, and people tended to sort of like bend in with some of those arguments. Now, I wouldn't say that this was something that gripped much of the Iranian population. For as long as I used to go to Iran, and I haven't been to Iran for many years, but I think the last time I went was 2005. But I used to go very regularly in the 1990s. And as those of you who study Iran will know, that every year there's a Jerusalem Day march, and there was sort of Palestine Day and this and that and the other. And I have to say that even in the 1990s and the early noughties, this was becoming, people were getting quite bored with it. I mean, there's no doubt about it that and I said this in an article somewhere, I said, these attendance at these marches was more ritualistic than passionate. I mean, people were not as into it. They just went there because it was, it was a day out and they wanted to be seen to be, loyal to the regime to some extent. Attendance at these meetings, of course, at these gatherings has been declining over the years. And that's also an interesting development. So what you're seeing really in the period from Ahmadinejad onwards is a hardening of views towards Israel among the elite. And there's very little doubt in my mind that Ahmadinejad's views reflected the views of Khamenei and the IRGC and the hardline elite there. That is, to my mind, there's no doubt about that. But as the regime's views on Israel hardened, it's interesting that the gap between the regime's views and the views of ordinary Iranians also widened. That many ordinary Iranians were not interested really in this sort of perpetual war, as they saw it, with Israel. They found, if you look at the diaspora links and others, there was a huge amount of contact and communication in that sense. And they just didn't feel that this was a productive way for the country to be going forward. I don't think there was any love lost, by the way, for various Israeli administrations. That's a separate thing. I think they found some of the activities of some of the harder line Israeli administrations to be unacceptable. But the point is that I don't think for many of them it was so unacceptable that they wanted to do anything about it. I mean, that's the difference. And increasingly, as life becomes tougher and tougher in Iran, there was more of a focus within Iran than the domestic politics. So what you're seeing really, for me, the pivotal moment, the inflection point in Iranian politics, for me, is 2009. In 2009, and the Green Movement is the moment when things begin to change. And I want to emphasize that it's begin to change. I'm not, as a good historian, I would not like to sort of say that this is the moment it all changes, as if there's one moment when it suddenly sort of changes. But I do think we can say that in 2009, we get the first indications of a change in mood, which you're now seeing the development of. And that is that for the first time, you start to see chants on the streets that are definitely anti the government's policy. There's a lot of frustration, for instance, at the expenditure of money, as they see it, on Hamas, Hezbollah in particular. So a couple of the chants that come out are about Gaza and Lebanon. These are very much directed towards Hamas and Hezbollah. They identify the Islamic Republic's support for these, quote, resistance movements as support for a sort of an Islamized, political Islam, which they don't like. I mean, it's quite interesting. And I mean, you people, you guys living in Israel will have a better appreciation of this, I think, than many people living in the West. And that is that, if you're living in an environment which is, and certainly in Iran, if you're living under the sort of rubric of an Islamic government for 44 years, you tend not to have quite the same sort of sense of resistance or whatever, or appreciation of that, as someone in the West who might not have any connection with this at all and see this wholly through the lens either of Washington or London or Berlin or Paris or whatever, or for that matter, Tel Aviv. So it's the point is, for the Iranians, it was ordinary Iranians, it was becoming increasingly problematic. Yes, they could appreciate, and I've talked to people about this, yes, they could appreciate the plight of the Palestinians. They had sympathy for the plight of the Palestinians. But they made direct correlations between the strength of Hezbollah, the success of Hezbollah, and the success of Hamas or Islamic Jihad or any of the militias in the region, and the success of the state in Iran. So the weaker these became, the weaker the regime became, and that had to be for them a good thing. Okay, I mean there was a direct correlation in that respect. So they saw really in Hezbollah and others, and I mean you have to sort of really understand. I mean I was very struck over the last summer. The attitude even towards Hezbollah is very, very striking. You know, Khamenei's affection for Nasrallah and his promotion of Hezbollah has caused a lot of friction in Iran among ordinary Iranians. I mean, there's no, because let me put it this way, in a very simple way. The Iranian regime has spent a lot more time and propaganda and money promoting Nasrallah, Sinwar, and others as martyrs than it has done on the Iranians themselves who were killed in the Israeli strike, you know, a month ago, whatever it was. You know, I think there were 4 radar operators. And there's a lot of irritation at this. You know, they sort of say, well, why are you, you know, why are you not giving that? Why are they not martyrs? I mean, are they? So you can see immediately this sort of friction is emerging, and this gulf of opinion there has been emerging. So that is something that I think that if you look at the level of disaffection that is emerging among the Iranian population towards its own government, it's a feeling that Iran, the regime, is spending far too much economic and political capital, and I think it's the political capital is also important in supporting anti-Israeli movements in the area. Now, let me answer one thing. So the Iranians tend to say, and they always used to say to me, I used to say to them, you know, why do you support Hezbollah? You know, what is the point of it? They say, well, we have to support Hezbollah because you know, it's a deterrence. We have to support Hezbollah as a deterrence because the Israelis are a threat. And we have to. And I said, why are the Israelis a threat? Why do you think the Israelis are a threat? And the assumption is they are. Okay. You drill down a bit deeper, of course, and the problem here is an ideological one which they won't really recognize. And it's simply this, that you have in this dispute between the modern state of Israel and the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Revolution, the fact that one state does not recognize the other state's right to exist. And that's obviously a problem. Okay. I mean, if you're thinking about the future, a real problem there is, certainly from your perspective or looking at it from the perspective of Israel, is you're confronting a state, let's look at a political system and a state, not a people, a state that has as one of its goal the elimination of the state of Israel. And I don't buy this argument, by the way, that it's all passive and, you know, that they're all sitting back and, you know, they're just waiting for it to happen. And someone said a bit like South Africa or something. No, it's very clear to me that there is an agenda and an ideology, certainly among hardliners there, that the Israeli state will end, and it's our duty to do what we can to hasten that end. Okay, so there is you know, there is a fundamental sort of gap in the sort of the realms of possibility in the ideology there. For most Iranians, this is simply not an issue. I mean, it's not a fight they want to get involved in. And as I said, while they might have sympathy for the broader issue of the Palestinians, they're not actually interested in getting engaged in a fight with Israel itself. And one of the striking things, so if you look at the sort of the problems that have emerged in Iran towards the Iranian state since 2017. So we have a slight gap because of the JCPOA and because of the people that believe the JCPOA is going to deliver a certain result for Iran. I mean, I'm talking about ordinary Iranians. And of course, that hope is dashed fairly quickly. Okay, it doesn't take too long to disappear. And then from 2017 onwards, you get a series of protests, and the protests become more and more violent. In actual fact, though, I should point out, though, the 2019 protests were much more violent than the 2022 ones. But it seems to me that the Women Life Freedom protest, it sort of seared itself into the public imagination in a way that the previous two did not. And so if you go back to 2009 as what I call the inflection point, when these views start to get held, in which you get the rift between the government and the people particularly over relations with Israel, you see that mounting really throughout 2017, 2019, 2022. And then, of course, the critical factor of the war last year after the October the 7th massacres, and then obviously the war in Gaza and the war in Lebanon. And this is a point that I was trying to relate to people, and I got into a little bit of trouble with some of my colleagues here about it, because I wrote 2 articles about this, and I sort of said that actually one of the striking things, and this was back in, I think, November, probably November last year, or October. It might have been October, and I can check the date when I put that. And I said, actually, most Iranians aren't actually that interested in this. They can't, you had demonstrations everywhere in European capitals, you had protests here, protests there. You probably had a lot of protests in Israel itself, to be honest, but there was nothing in Iran. I mean, this is the interesting thing. There was nothing in Iran. And, people would say, well, why is this? Surely for the Iranian establishment, this is a pivotal moment. Their moment has arrived. This is the moment where Israel is a real threat. It's real vulnerable, very vulnerable. This is the time for Iran to really realize its rhetoric, in a sense. But what we discovered really is that Iran was in some ways trapped by its rhetoric. I mean, it didn't want to get engaged in one level because its political situation at home was very, very difficult. On the other hand, it also didn't seem to have any support from its populace for this sort of thing. So by my reckoning, the largest demonstration in Iran, pro-Palestinian demonstration in Iran over the last 9 months hasn't exceeded 3,000. I mean, you have to really sort of let that, you have to digest that. I mean, it's a remarkable situation that Iran, that sees itself as the core funder and principal element of the axis of resistance, which is aimed towards the Western world, and Israel as the keystone of that Western establishment, the unjust world order, can't get its own people excited about this at all. I mean, it can't. And not only that, it doesn't want to really mobilize large groups of people on the street, because those large groups of people on the street might turn against them. So they need to be very careful how this is managed. And I think that in some ways is perhaps most indicative of the gulf in opinion between people in Iran and their government. The government is arguing for a particular development that it wants to do. And we can go through the details of the attacks that happened in the exchange, we finally got to a stage where we're attacking each other's home countries, away from the proxy war into the sort of more direct war. But I'm also very struck by this, that the Iranians are very uncomfortable about getting engaged in a direct confrontation with Israel and, God forbid, with the United States. I'd always worked on the assumption, by the way, the last 10, 15 years, I'd always worked on the assumption that the Iranian regime had factored in to its calculations that it could sustain an attack by Israel, and that actually it would work in its favor, because, basically it would encourage a certain amount of rallying around the flag. I don't think it can rely on that anymore. One, I don't think it can count on the fact that people will rally around the flag. Of course, it depends what happens in this. I mean, let's be very careful. But if you look at Israel's last attack on Iran, it was very, very carefully calibrated and very, very carefully targeted. So if you sustain that sort of thing, it will be very difficult for them to rally people around the flag. I mean, because people are not as interested. But more than that, they're not particularly excited by the prospect of having to put their heads above the parapet, which is what they've had to do. They would much rather others did the fighting for them. And of course, that's also a problem for them, because, being the leaders of the axis of resistance, there are many elements of, quote, the axis of resistance who are saying it's all very well and good, talking a good talk from Tehran, but you might as well walk the walk as well and join us in this confrontation, which of course they have not been willing to do. Now, I hesitate to say all this, and that suddenly you find the Iranians have decided they're going to launch, the third part of their strategies. They keep talking about it, but my instinct, I have to say, in looking at it, is that the Iranian domestic political economy is in not such a good shape that it wants to not now start to escalate, particularly now where you have a ceasefire in Lebanon. It's probably not the best time for them to do it, and I suspect they will probably want to ease back into their comfort zone and stay away from this conflict. But what's striking for me over the last 10 months is that it's for the first time we've seen very clearly how trapped they are by their own rhetoric. They talk a very, very powerful, that's the regime, talk a very, very powerful talk against Israel, and yet they haven't really been able to deliver on this talk. They keep threatening, of course, that they have a lot more, in the closet. But again, I'm not so sure that they're as confident, both domestically, but also in their own abilities abroad, to be able to achieve the sort of things that they want to do. So in some ways, they've been outmaneuvered, politically and ideologically outmaneuvered. And you do wonder actually what impact this may have on thinking in Iran. I mean, I hesitate to say that it will deliver anything substantive, but certainly what you're seeing here is a widening of that gap, and and that gap is becoming it's being cemented in that sense. I mean, you're not going to get, certainly from my understanding and reading of what we might loosely term public opinion. I mean, these are very difficult to assess in Iran, but if you look at it, public opinion in terms of what practical actions are being taken, they're not getting that sort of enthusiasm anymore. Now, I was asked, and I will say this, I mean, in terms of what the solutions are in the future. Well, first of all, I think just to recap really in terms of one is that I think we have to reframe the argument and reframe the relationship as a historic relationship. And I think there needs to be a lot more work done on that historic relationship. I'm going to make a plea here. Mayor knows about this, by the way. I've already talked to him about it. I'm willing to push it out there again that, what we need to do as academics in particular and scholars about it is we need to reframe this argument away from the present, increasingly towards the past, so that we can actually provide a better context for the current situation. And, as Rachel said at the beginning, if you can see the animosity now as a consequence, in some ways, as a reflection of the intimacy that preceded it, you have something to build on. I think if you looked at the relationship purely from the fact of the ideology of the Islamic Revolution, which is you have to put in a box on its own at the moment, the prognosis is very, very grim. Unless the Islamic Revolution suddenly decides that it no longer wants to be a revolution, which is, by the way, always very possible with these things. But, let's say for the sake of argument, at the moment, the Islamic, revolution is holding fast to its particular worldview. I think from a broader scholarly perspective, what needs to be done on a broader level is a reframing of that argument to show really how connected and intimate that relationship has been over the centuries, if not millennia, by the way. I mean, and this is the important thing. Okay, you have to do it in that sense. And once you reframe that argument, you can then build a picture that comes to the present, which is much more nuanced and interesting. And it also explains, to my mind, why among ordinary Iranians, there's a lot more ambivalence. I'm not going to say it's stronger than that. I don't want to say that there's a huge amount of affection or love or this or that or the other. But what I do want to say is that you don't get the sort of animosity that might exist in the wider Arab world. That for the Iranians themselves, they don't see the Arab-Israeli conflict as their fight. And I should say among Iranians now, it probably is moving towards a certain amount of affection, by the way. I mean, I don't want to make a definitive statement on that because it's very difficult for us to assess these views, and public opinion can be quite fickle. But at the same time, played properly and handled properly, cultivating Iranian public opinion should not be difficult. Should not be difficult because they're receptive to it. I mean, they're receptive to it and they want to hear, something that's much more positive, and that will distance themselves from the regime. So I do think that one of the things that we need to do as a scholarly community is to reframe that argument in all its nuance. In all its nuance. I'm not saying we need to whitewash it and provide a very romantic image of what that relationship is, but I do think, we need to do a lot more work in explaining why the Persia-Judaic heritage is so strong. And I don't think there's been hardly any work done on it, actually. I mean, there's been obviously stuff done on the ancient period. There's not been enough stuff done on the late antique period and the medieval period. And certainly there hasn't really been a huge amount of stuff done on, I mean, presumably there has been some stuff done in Israel, by the way, but, I haven't seen a huge amount of stuff done on sort of the relationship between Iran and Israel, or Iran and its Jewish community really in the modern era. And I think that needs to be explored both on a political and a theological level. Then you can begin to deconstruct, I think, what the Islamic Republic represents. There is a belief among some people that the Islamic Revolution represents a restoration of the normal run of things from the Pahlavi aberration. I actually argue a different view. I think that the Islamic Revolution is the aberration, and that the Pahlavi period, albeit an accelerated period of modernization, was really a continuation of the Qajar period. I mean, it there, you see the continuities there much, much better than you see in the post-79 period. And if you see the Islamic Revolution as that aberration, you can then start to imagine a post-Islamic revolutionary period, if I can put it that way, in which we then do revert to a much more structured and constructive relationship. Again, not one without its problems. We shouldn't be childish about this, but one that's a much more constructive relationship between Iran and wider Judaism, but also Iran and Israel. And I think that is reflected in the fact that, we have a reservoir of goodwill, if you will, to draw on. It's just that we've largely ignored it because we're too preoccupied with the present that we don't actually deal with some of the things in the past. And I think that's principally, what, my hypothesis, thesis, whatever you want to call it, has been, and it's been now for well over a decade, that when you look at the relationship, just as I looked at the relationship between Iran and the United States, I think the Iran-Israel one is a much more acute one, a much more intimate one, and a much more, I have to say, matter of kinship, if I can put it that way. I know that's a slightly odd way perhaps to put it, but it is a much more a matter of kinship in a way that the Iran and the West is not, actually. And yes, we know that family disputes are often the worst, but there is something to be said for the fact of looking at it within that framework. And as I said, I look forward to the day when Hamid, David, myself, and others settle in for a conference on the Cyrus Accords and start to discuss the way in which a better future can be constructed between the various these various different peoples. I think I'll stop there because about 50 minutes, Rachel. Is that okay? I think I've probably
That's
exhausted
wonderful. I'm
people, and
sure that,
and I'm happy to answer questions that people may have.
yeah, thank you very much. That was comprehensive and so many important insights. I'm sure that there are many comments and questions. Anyone who wants to ask a question, you can put in the chat or in the question and answers section, or raise your hand. Okay. You see. Okay. 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 So I will just go ahead and
Sure.
take the first question. There were so many interesting things that I noted and wanted to ask you to further develop, but maybe I'll just start with a maybe simple question. How do you see the election of Donald Trump maybe impacting the trajectory um, that we're on?
Well, this is always when I mean, Rachel, I mean, that's a hell of a question. The trouble with Donald Trump is really that, he's very unpredictable. And I mean, as I always said to someone, I said, it's always quite good to be unpredictable to your enemies. It's a bit more difficult when you're unpredictable to your friends. I mean, I have to think that I think the second Trump presidency might be a little bit more organized than the first one, partly because, I mean, I certainly think he's been much more prepared for it on this occasion. And we have to see how that works. I mean, clearly, the relationship, but what I will say about this, I mean, it's slightly different to say the purely Iran-Israel dynamic. I mean, I was noticing last time around, there are two American presidents, by the way, in recent memory, who've been described as the Cyrus of the age. And one of them, would believe it or not, was Obama, by the way, that everyone missed, but because it was a minor thing. But Trump had a medal and a coin and this sort of thing. So it's all very clear there. And he's obviously a great friend to the state of Israel. So on that front, we can see, I think from an Israeli point of view, well, I mean, it's difficult to say it's a good thing, but certainly there's a certain amount of, I think there must be some sort of reassurance that he's not going to cut and run. Let's put it that way. Now, the interesting thing about the Iranian relationship with Trump is quite striking, because when Trump was first elected in 2016, the Iranians also have this, and this is hangover. I mean, I'm sure others will. First of all, the Iranians have always felt that the Republicans are better for them than the Democrats. And that's irrespective of who the Republican candidate is, despite the fact that you would say to them repeatedly that, no, this is quite different. George W. Bush is not, what you think it is, or, Trump is. But even when Trump came in 2016, the art of the deal translated into Persian was a bestseller in Tehran, as you know. I mean, everyone sort of read it, and they all seem to think it's marvelous. And of course, they see him as a deal maker, and of course, he sees himself as a deal maker. So they see there's a certain amount of flexibility there. I have to say, I think probably the view in Iran is that Trump will not be a good thing for them. There is this view, of course, that Trump would say, and he had said before the election that we don't want regime change, which is good. But he also said, we'd be happy to sit down and have and talk and whatever. And now the thing is one has to suspect that the people around Trump are not going to necessarily be thinking like that, and that Trump was not articulating it in quite the way he was it came out. I mean, it seems to me that one might say that what Trump is really talking about is that he has no problem with the Iranian people. I don't think it will have gone down well with him that some of the members of the Iranian regime were trying to kill him. So that will obviously rebound quite badly on him. But it's difficult to say what the precise dynamic will be in terms of the relationship between Iran and Israel. It really, at the moment, and there are others on this list that might have better insights than me, it really, for me, depends on who he appoints to run Iran policy. And I actually don't know yet who those. I have some idea, but I don't know yet who's been appointed. So I don't know what the consequence of that will be. And I think we have to wait and see. My only, I suppose, cautiously sort of optimism is the wrong term, but cautiously sort of changes that I don't think it will be as chaotic as it was the first time round.
Um, looking in our chat.
David.
David, David is okay. Sorry. Can you unmute him?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Ali, for honoring us to participate, to open this series of discussions about Iran and Israel.
It's a great thrill to see you here, David.
Yes, yes. We have a long history together. I thought that you will clear up things for me.
Okay.
We are all confused with Iran and Israel and what are the motivations and what is the ultimate goal of Iran and why is this such hatred towards Israel? It's a combination of ideology and interest. But Iran has shown that they can be more pragmatic from time to time. Even the extremists, even Ayatollah Khomeini during the war with Iraq, who spoke about the centrality of maslahah, the interest. Khamenei in 2013 actually allowing negotiations that brought about this JCPOA. But the question that I have, basically more than one question, is that what make Israel, what make Iran or Khamenei, and when I mean Iran, I mean the Iranian regime, it's the Islamic regime, so obsessed with Israel? They learn to live with other enemies, and somehow the only point that I see in the policy that it's permanent from the early days of the revolution until now, it is animosity towards Israel. As though Israel is the center of universe, and they think they are the center of universe. So they made us center of universe.
Yeah.
Is there anything that Israel has done, or is something built in the nature of the Israeli, in the eyes of Iran? And then when it comes to the policy in Iran, you know, Khomeini spoke about Maslaha and Khatami and others, but they didn't say whose Maslaha, whose interest defined the policy. Is it the interest of Islam? It's the interest of Iran. It's the interest of the the regime. And it seems to me more and more that it's the interest of the supreme leader. Actually, he has made it much more central. But, you know, he is the Islamic Revolution because he's supreme leader since 89. So is it distinctive to Khamenei? Thinks about Israel that it's more Khamenei and the circle around him? Because one last point is that today you hear about the Iranian, know you are aware of it. There is criticism from within the regime. There is criticism, even Ghalibaf recently, what he said about the problems that Iran has. And with all these issues inside Iran, they somehow try to divert attention towards the far away enemy. And maybe it's another interest is simply to make a giant enemy and unify people around it. So I'm not clear about it, not something and you say that, you know, I like in your recent article that you speak about there are too much of history, politics in history and not enough history in the politics. And I think that today everything is political, everything is
Yeah,
politics.
I
It's
can't agree
very
with you
difficult
more.
to distinguish between them.
Mm. No, I mean, I mean, I'm glad you raised that. I mean, that's you know, an important theme that I'm really trying to push in this, and that is this sort of notion of much more applied history in what we're doing. I think there is far too much politics in history, and if we had a much better understanding, I think, you know, it could contextualize things better. Now, to address a number of your points, I do think it's Khamenei's vision. I mean, I do think it's about the animosity towards Israel is an ideological one that's founded within the tenets of the Islamic Revolution back in 1979. You can see it within Khomeini's own writings, that as much as he talks about interest and pragmatism, actually, I mean, I have to say, I think Khomeini's understanding of pragmatism is pragmatism in the interests of the revolution. You know, it's not pragmatism, you know, as we would necessarily understand it. It means basically, as Khamenei would say, heroic flexibility. And I mean, heroic flexibility was something that was so badly interpreted, you know, in the run-up to the JCPOA. You know, everyone used to say, oh, it shows a lot of leeway and a lot of flexibility. It didn't. I mean, Khamenei explained it himself, but nobody wanted to listen. He said, you know, in order to achieve our strategic objectives, sometimes, you know, the wrestler can make a tactical withdrawal in order to, you know, defeat his opponent. So basically, the strategy is clearly there. Now, why? And I think you're also right, and that's why I tried to sort of explain that there's been a degree of fluidity in terms of the relationship towards Israel over the last 44 years. But it's most definitely hardened in the last 20 years. That I think that there's a this sort of revolutionary ideology has become much more embedded, and Israel is a focus of that, in part because it reminds the Islamic Revolution that it is a revolution. I mean, there's a lot else about Iran that is not really any revolutionary anymore, but the hijab, the veil, and animosity towards Israel are two tenets that it wants to sort of really stick by and is dying in a ditch over. And the attraction of the animosity towards Israel is it allows the Islamic Republic to basically promote its soft power abroad. You know, it's a little bit like the nationalism that they've played over the nuclear agreement. It allows them to draw in diaspora people to sort of support them. I mean, think about this, David, which is that, you know, these are perversions. I mean, it's perverse that in the United States there are, you know, coaching people, you know, from Press TV and others or whatever, coaching Americans who don't speak Persian to sort of chant death to America. Now, I mean, you know, why is that? I mean, how is that happening? Part of it is happening because there's a sort of an unholy alliance, if you will, a marriage of convenience, or whatever metaphor you want to use, analogy you want to use, which basically, because of an animosity towards the state of Israel among certain constituencies in the West, marries into this sort of appeal of the Islamic Republic, who seems to be hard and fast, without compromise, uncompromisingly anti-Israeli, and they're able to promote that. The paradox is they're not able to persuade their own people anymore. I mean, that is the paradox. The paradox is, while they're convincing people on the streets of London, you know, to carry, I don't know, flags from dubious organizations in Iran itself, there's a sort of a sense of bewilderment that people are doing this. So I actually think it's not in Iran's interest. It's not remotely in Iran's. If you had a national interest of Iran, animosity with Israel is not part of the national interest of Iran. I don't even think it's an Islamic thing, actually, to be honest. But I do think it's a revolutionary Islamic thing. And as you, I think, quite rightly said, it's identified with the person of Khamenei. Khamenei's gone there. And because he's, what is he now, 87? I don't know how old he is. I don't think he's going to have an attack of heroic flexibility before he dies. Let me put it that way. I think he's going to stick by his guns on that. That's one of the legacies he wants to leave. Now, things might change with his successor, although if I'm correct and it's his son, I don't think it will. But, you know, things will change in Iran for the simple reason that the state at the moment is not sustainable in the long run. I mean, it's not able to deliver electricity, gas, water to its citizens. It's in serious problems. And sooner or later, this is going to snap. Now, you know, some people say sooner rather than later. It might be later. I don't know. But at the moment, the trajectory is not a good one. And so it cannot afford. I mean, this is the paradox, of course, just at the time when it feels it can realize its animosity towards Israel in this final struggle, it can't afford to do it. Because the risk is if it engages in this final struggle with Israel, the real victim will be itself, will be the regime itself. And again, when I look at it, I was talking to someone, I said, is regime survival the principal objective of the regime? And actually, lots more people are saying that's the wrong way to think about the regime anymore. It's not regime survival, but it is sort of the survival as it sees it of the revolution. It's the purity of the revolution as it wants to see it. And part of that, central tenet to that, is a sort of an animosity towards Israel, which it sees as a principled stance, by the way, and it sees as a sort of a, part of this wider panoply of sort of arguments of, the revolution of the oppressed against the oppressor, so on and so forth. But, one of the beauties, as I said, of Ahmadinejad is that he was the person who articulated this ideology so explicitly, clearly, simplistically, if you will, vulgar, but nonetheless, it was clear. I mean, we could see it for the first time. He wore the regime's ideology on his sleeve, and we could all see it. And it was apparent what was going on. And I think once that ambiguity was removed, of course, lots of Iranians themselves were deeply shocked by it. But that's the way I mean, when you say you find it difficult to understand this animosity, I think you should find it difficult to understand because it's an ideological animosity. And as an ideological animosity, it has its own internal logic. It's not a logic that we would necessarily understand.
Thank you for that. Along with this idea of the sort of the guardian of the oppressed, there's a question here that's wondering if you can explain why the Islamic Republic supports Armenia against Shiite Azerbaijan and doesn't mention the Muslim
that's
leaders.
good. Yeah. Now that's because in the 1990s, of course. I mean, it was always great. I mean, basically because the Armenians presented themselves as good Iranians. I mean, that's basically what they did. I mean, the Armenians presented themselves in the 1990s as very pro-Iran and actually as Aryans. Okay, and the Iranians loved that. They were very flattered by this. The Azeris argued that they were Turks and sided with basically the Turkish Republic over Iran. And that's why basically, in essence, the Iranians decided to switch their support in the Caucasus towards Armenia and rather than Azerbaijan. And of course, the Armenians at the time also supported by the Russians in those days anyway, not anymore, I don't think, but by the Russians, that sort of tied in this sort of alliance, this alliance of convenience that was emerging between the Russians and the Iranians at the time. But I remember it very clearly in the 1990s. Everyone was quite surprised by it for obvious reasons. It's very largely because the Azeris did not promote themselves as a Shia power, but they promoted themselves as a Turkish power, a bit like the disputes that were going on in Central Asia, by the way, between different Central Asian states. And the Iranians and the Turks were competing for attention there. Although at the end of the day, I think the Russians are the dominant player. But it also highlighted this fact that all the way up through the 1990s and the early noughties, there was a strong strand of Iranian foreign policy thinking, geopolitical thinking and stuff that was drawn essentially from a very, very strong nationalist ideology which competed with it. As I said, I think that sort of nationalist ideology, although it works quite effectively for the diaspora abroad, has largely been now suppressed behind this sort of I don't even call it an Islamic ideology. I mean, I think it's much more a revolutionary ideology in Iran, because there are aspects of the ideology in Iran that many Orthodox Muslims would find quite troubling. I mean, even the notion of Elat-e-Faqih is quite troubling to many Orthodox Muslims. So these things are I think these things just simply reflect, in a sense, Rachel, that sort of the complexity of the sort of the foreign policy sort of attitudes in Iran.
Thank you. There aren't any other questions right at this moment in the chat.
I'm very impressed that I've silenced everyone. I don't know how I did it, but
I am too. I think it's my fault for not reminding everyone in the beginning to use the chat option function. So I will just take the moment to ask another question. If I think that there are some assessments that maybe under a Trump presidency, that Russia's role in Syria might be, acquiesced to, enlarged. How do you see Iran responding to that? Do you think that Iran
is that one of Trump's ideas? Was that?
I mean, I've seen a lot of assessments that,
I mean, the other thing is that I think, from what I understand, neither the Syrians or the Russians really want the Iranians in Syria. So, you know, they have this slight problem that they're not really loved in that sense there. So, you know, and I mean, again, people on this list, on this talk will probably know better than me, but as I understand it, even when the Israelis were flying over Syrian and Iraqi airspace towards Iran, I don't think the Russians interfered in any way with that, you know, so it was a bit of a part. And I know that the Iranians, I mean, certainly Iranians were very, very upset at the lack of support from the Russians, I have to say. So, I mean, I do think the events, I mean, let me be, you know, very clear. I think, you know, the Israelis have scored some notable military successes over the summer. I think they've done it at the expense of quite a lot of political capital, it has to be said, and that needs to be borne in mind. But I think that undoubtedly it's weakened Iran's hand in the region. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And the consequences for that for Iran will be quite interesting to see what they do, whether they try and double down in their zones of influence in Iraq and Syria and other places, or whether they will begin a process of gradual withdrawal from some of these places. Now, that will be very interesting to see. And certainly in Syria, I think the view is that they would be encouraged to go, or certainly reduce their footprint there by the Russians and the Syrians. I mean, and again, I'm speculating here, and I shouldn't really speculate, but there was one of the assassinations that occurred in Syria, I think of the IRGC, something, you know, there was at some stage, there was a point where someone said that some of the intelligence that was gathered was actually gathered from Syrians. I mean, it was the Syrians who leaked the information. So, you know, who knows? I mean, I think as I think you are only too well aware, Middle East politics can be very, very murky. So who knows?
Thank you, Leora.
You're muted, Leora.
Oh yeah, you're still muted.
Oh, is there a central demute?
Do you want
Ask to unmute. There you are. There you are, Leora.
Okay. Hi, Ali.
Hi.
Great to see you, and even more wonderful to hear you. Thank you for your talk. And thank you for calling for more research to be done on the topic and its potential. I'm all for it. So count me in if you're working on something.
Definitely. I'm very up for it.
I wanted to ask actually about the Pahlavis and whether you think that the visit of Reza Pahlavi back in, I think it was March or April last year in Israel, had any effect inside Iran or outside in terms of, I don't know, escalating or adding anything to the animosity or to the way Iranians view Israel and Iran, or Israel's position when it comes to the future of Iran, even, I don't know, any sort of
I think the view of that is quite mixed, I'll be honest with you. I mean, and I'm only taking this from sort of what I can read online and stuff like that. I mean, it's very difficult to make a proper assessment. I think people are interested in Reza Pahlavi, although he slightly dampened his own position by saying he would never move to Iran. You know, I mean, he basically wants to play much more of a background role in some ways. But you know, it is quite interesting to see that the debate that it's engendered within Iran. There's certainly a much, much stronger monarchist sentiment among young people than we would have originally anticipated. Now, whether that will, you know, redound to Reza Pahlavi himself is a different question. I mean, I wouldn't want to necessarily go there. I think he's a much more controversial is the wrong figure, but he's not a unifying figure in that sense. I mean, we've seen that really with the whole collapse of the Georgetown agreement. But within Iran, I think the views, because they're somewhat more detached from what's going on, you know, they're basically seeing the visuals of it. I think, you know, irrespective of his visits to Israel and what he's, you know, his relationship with Netanyahu and others, I think there's a general view that, you know, what Reza Pahlavi is doing, at the very least, is he's shifting the debate away from say what used to be the traditional debate, you know, when these things happened, about the Mujahideen Khalq, for instance. So we don't hear as much about them, and we hear a lot more about Reza Pahlavi. for good or ill. You know, I'm not saying that, but at least the debate has moved slightly, and it's in a different area. I will say about the Pahlavis in general, away from Reza Pahlavi himself, that and I said this about a decade ago, by the way. I mean, I remember saying this. The pumping out of documentaries by the satellite television channels, you know, Manotor and Iran International, about the Pahlavi period, have, in my view, had a profound effect on public opinion in Iran. It's created a completely different image. Now, a lot of these documentaries are not what we would call historical documentaries. I mean, some of them are, some of them are not, right? But they generally want to give a much more positive light, you know. And for Iranians who watch this, they see a monarch who spoke English and French fluently, who dressed well, who mixed very comfortably in international circles, who seemed to have a certain amount of influence, who seemed to have, who's, by the way, whose views on Israel or, you know, the Jewish lobby, as he described it to Mike Wallace and others, you know, were not uncontroversial. You know, I mean, he had his views. So, but also, you know, I mean, I think there's an interesting view that what might have happened with the Arab-Israeli conflict had the Shah survived. And could the Shah have behaved a much more constructive role, actually, in that than was to happen? I mean, these are interesting questions. Now, a lot of these are sort of very academic questions, and obviously they're spelling. But it is interesting, I think, that the whole Pahlavi era is being reviewed and reassessed. And now, you know, you have this phrase in Iran, very popular among the young, effectively called the 79ers. And they basically berate the 79ers because they say the 79ers basically sold our future. You know, I mean, they basically and it's quite interesting how they're reflecting. As I said, it's nostalgia to some extent, I mean, to maybe a large extent, but it has changed the frame of the debate. And I think that's another thing that we need to think about a little bit more carefully and see what's going on. But it's certainly had an effect on younger public opinion, as I think I would say. But also, you know, there are some older people who are, you know, I remember, I mean, as you say, if you're a historian and you teach these, I mean, 20 years ago when I used to teach in class about the Pahlavis, I used to teach the Pahlavis in a particular way. And certainly Reza Shah in a particular way, right? And then, you know, now, 44 years after the Islamic Revolution, you sort of think, well, you know, there were a lot of things wrong in the Pahlavi period, but you know, actually, to be honest, on some levels, they got things right. You know, I mean, they didn't, you know, and I think that's a general view among younger people in Iran now who are almost kicking back against some of the anti-Pahlavi rhetoric and propaganda that they've been fed for so many years. I mean, to my mind, I have to say to you, one of the reasons for good cheer in the long term is that younger Iranians and the wider Iranian population have not been successfully indoctrinated with anything at all. I mean, there is a group that have been, obviously, and believe a certain thing about the Islamic Revolution, but a vast majority of the population have not been, in my view, successfully indoctrinated by the official ideology of the Islamic Revolution. In fact, they've kicked back against it. And in some ways, of course, that leads to maybe a simple understanding of the other side. But nonetheless, it means that the terrain for me is quite wide open. There's a terrain of contestation, if I can put it that way, that we really should be getting much, much more engaged with, which goes back to my point, Leora, about why we need to be doing so much more work on this and not leaving it.
Great. We have time for just one last quick question. John Lawrence, I think everyone's unmuted, is able to unmute themselves right now. So John,
Excellent.
if you want to go ahead.
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay.
I can't see you, John, but I can hear you.
Okay.
Love to see you.
Well, let's see if I can.
If I can. Don't worry. I don't feel him.
See if I can make it. Let's see if this works. There.
Excellent.
He's one of the
I think
79.
it works. Well, hello, Ali and David. I haven't seen you all for a good many years now. And good to see that you're looking well, both of you. And I do have a question here. First, thanks, Ali. I think this was very well put, the presentation. I happen to agree with you entirely that this whole need for reframing the things in a historical context instead of an ideological one. and happen to also believe that your observation is correct. The animosity is really more ideological than historical. But I do have a question for you, and it's basically a pretty simple one. Who is the existential threat to whom? The way you have framed this, again, I think correctly, is that it is Iran, which is an existential threat to Israel, the way this has evolved. But if you can look at the other side of the coin as well, from the Iranian perspective, is there not an issue here of Israel being the existential threat to Iran? I think back to the time when, with the very strong American presence there in Iraq and in Afghanistan, where you had a situation where there were 27 military bases, including a couple of carriers in the Persian Gulf or in the Indian Ocean, where every single border of Iran was open essentially to attack from American military, from air bases, from aircraft carriers, and in virtually every country touching upon Iran. This certainly created a situation where it led to that sense of being under attack themselves constantly. And I'm wondering if you have any comments on that, or whether that's played into this whole issue or not. And how do you get beyond that?
I mean, so basically, I mean, and I've thought about this because I used to be, for those of you who've been at various sort of track 2 or 2.5 or whatever they're called these days meetings, I used to have quite a lot of these meetings. And I mean, I'm actually increasingly of the view that if you're talking about an existential threat to a state, then that I don't think it's part of Israel's ideology or worldview that Iran must not exist. I mean, I've never seen that. Yes, there are some cabinet ministers who speak in fairly rancid terms, let's be honest about it, about various different things, not least the Palestinians. But I don't think the relationship with Iran actually is one that is, yes, anti the Islamic Revolution and anti, in some ways, the Islamic Republic. But that's the state, it's the political system rather than the country. And there have been some, certainly in America and other places, who talked about, I mean, actually, it's Arab states have done it more, have talked about, the fragmentation of it. Iran is the last empire. We need to split it up. We need to do this, that, and the other. What I would say, by the way, for anyone thinking about a future relationship with Iran, that's a bad policy to take. And I would say to people that, and I've said this to Americans, I've said to others, you must not, basically, your appeal is to the Iranian people. The Iranian people are quite a nationalistic or patriotic, and one level. There are many caveats to that, by the way, but nonetheless, they have a certain understanding of Iran. And I think the issue here is that if Iran, for instance, was to come and say, we no longer think, and let me put it this way, I would even say that the Iranians would not have to formally recognize Israel. I actually have argued that there needs to be a system of normalization. I mean, as I said, if you're going to develop an Abrahamic Accords with the Arab world, then bring the Iranians in, and at the very least call their bluff. I mean, say to them, look, you can have this in return for this. We have a 2-state solution. You have normalization, but you have to do normalization. Now, let's not go that far. Let's not even go that far. Let's not push the Iranians too hard let's let them walk before they run, and say that they just take off the table the notion that the Israeli state has no right to exist. Just say, we don't want to get involved, back to the early noughties. I suspect then actually that for the Israelis, it's the problem will have been partially solved. I mean, I don't think they're going to necessarily want to decide. Why would the Israelis suddenly decide that they want to sort of be an existential threat to Iran? I appreciate the argument about the US bases. I entirely understand that. I mean, although I'd have to say, John, George W. Bush probably did more for Iranian hegemony in the region than virtually any other American president. So for all the fact that the Americans did create a fairly sort of make the Iranians feel quite vulnerable, the removal of Saddam Hussein and the Taliban were a great boon to Iran's strategic reach in the region. And, you know, more cynical and rather wry Iranians will often say that, you know, they say actually George W. Bush was quite good for us. You know, I mean, it was a positive. So I don't think, while there are some people who argue that, I don't think it's ever been official policy, neither in the American side of things nor actually in the Israeli side. So that's where I land on that. And I appreciate I'm probably offering a degree of clarity that some people think it doesn't deserve, whatever, but I think it's quite important. And I've been in meetings, you know, where I won't say any more about this, but I have been in meetings where there have been Israelis and there have been Iranians in the room, and the Iranians will simply not look at the Israelis. I mean, you know, this is absurd. If you're in a room, then you can look at them. I mean, you don't have to like them, but you can look at them. Whereas the Israelis would, you know, happily shake hands with everyone in the room. I mean, what the Israelis at the end want is recognition. I mean, that's basically it. Yeah. The Iranians were very, particularly the official Iranians, were very, very difficult about it and refused even to acknowledge that these people are in the room. So I think that is clearly a problem. I mean, and you know, I say this to people here. The solution to this, as everyone says, is dialogue. But for dialogue to happen, you have to have people who are willing to talk to each other. And there's no point having a dialogue with one group that refuse to even acknowledge the other group are in the room or exist. You know, I mean, this is not a. So I think that for me is a is quite clear, actually. I mean, I find that for me in my experience has been quite clear. I don't know. Was there a second part to the question? I can't remember, John. Sorry, I do apologize.
No, you've answered it very well.
Is that okay?
Although on the latter point there, would you say that the Israelis are willing to sit down and dialogue with the Iranians at this point?
Who knows, actually? I mean, to be honest, you're right. At this point, probably not. But I do know that in the past they have been. I mean, not necessarily at an official level, but let's start at the cultural level. I mean, let's start at a sort of thing. But I think that there would be a possibility. But you're right. I mean, I think it does take two to move. I mean, I'm not saying that. It does take two to move. But I can't see if the Iranians came, let's say I mean, I think the problem with the Islamic Revolution and the Islamic Revolutionary government is it's very difficult to know how far to trust, you know, what they're saying, what they're doing. But let's say for the sake of argument, the Iranians come out and they say, we're willing to recognize the state of Israel and we will engage in a dialogue wherever the Abrahamic, you know, wherever this Madrid 2 is going to take place or whatever, Madrid or whatever, then I think it would be foolish of the Israelis not to accept that offer. You know, I mean, let's put it that way. But you're right. I mean, there are problems on both sides of the equation. I just think that the ideological rift is on one side rather than the other. And I know I've got very little time left. There's one question that I can't really answer. I just want to say on the UAE stuff, if I may, I'm sorry about that. I really don't know enough about that. And the one thing, Hamid, that you did say, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, they don't mention, I mean, Iran's attitude towards the Muslim Uyghurs in China. I mean, I think it's very obvious that they know where their bread is buttered on that. So they're not going to get involved in supporting the Uyghurs. But then, you know, many people in the West aren't supporting the Uyghurs either, you know, even though what the Chinese are doing is pretty appalling. And
you had one more question about the nuclear, but I know that you have a hard stop.
Is that Iran's defense as a process user? Do you think they are? So the nuclear capability, I'll just say this actually, because I think it's quite interesting. I've always thought, and it's always been my belief, that the Iranians use their nuclear program as leverage. I mean, and they do it every time, and we fall for it every time. So every time something happens, they say, we're going to enrich to 60%. And normally the reaction in the West is, oh my God, we need to meet in Vienna and get this sorted. Actually, what's happening now for the first time is the West has got bored of the blackmail. So basically, you know, it's not happening. And yes, the Iranians might try, and there's a huge amount of jingoism online and nationalists huffing and puffing about, you know, how we're going to build a bomb. I've always felt in my own mind that this is a much, much more difficult thing for the Iranians to do than we imagine. And believe you me, if we did feel they were coming close to breakout, I think then you would get both the Americans and the Israelis would probably get involved, with probably European backing, by the way. I mean, I don't think that's really an option. The Iranians want to draw that sort of attention to themselves yet. more to the point, because I think for them it's the threat of doing it that matters. Once they do it, you know, it's a busted flush, you know, if they decide to do it, and then, you know, it's there's no going back. So I do think that issue on the nuclear, I've always felt that quite strongly, that this is a question of leverage for them, and they know that's how to grab the West's attention, basically. But interestingly enough, since Russia and Ukraine, it's not actually the top priority for many in the West anymore. It is a priority, but it's not, you know, they're not going to react to it in the same way. They're probably going to react to it in a much harsher way than they might have previously. I hope that's okay. I'm sorry about that, but I do have to run because I have a student waiting outside my door. Which
we thank you very much. It was a
thank you very
fascinating
much. Thank you
talk.
very much for the turnout. I hope I was able to inject some interesting
Absolutely.
ideas into the debate. I know it's a very, very difficult one, but if there's anyone out there who's interested in doing, and I think Tel Aviv and St. Andrews, marvelous partners here, you know, working on Perso-Judaic relations. Let's go for it.
Okay. Feel better, and we'll see you soon for the next
Thanks,
meeting on the
Rachel.
Cyrus Accords.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you
Bye.
so much. Yeah, fine. Oh, I see leave now. Leave me.